Something strange is happening as I write. I keep telling myself that I am writing as an account explaining my relationship with Tom and everything else that goes with it. Of course, the everything else, which is actually the point of writing this at all, is going to become much more difficult to write about very soon. My days have this kind of purpose that I haven't had since I retired from the school. I'm including all sorts of things, too, which may not be of interest to you, Patrick. But I don't care. I'll remember it all, for myself as well as for you. And as I write, I wonder if I will ever have the courage to actually read this to you. That has been my plan, but the closer I get to the everything else, the more unlikely it seems. You were particularly trying this morning, refusing to look at the television even though I'd switched it from This Morning, which we both hate, to a rerun of As the Time Goes By on BBC Two. Don't you like Dame Judi Dench? I thought everyone liked Dame Judi. I thought her combination of classical actressness and cuddly accessibility, that I in her name says so much, doesn't it, made her irresistible. And then there's that incident with the liquidized cornflakes, the tipping over of the bowl which made Tom exhale a hefty tut. I knew you weren't quite up to sitting at the table for breakfast, even with your special cutlery and your cushions that provided to stabilize you, as Nurse Pamela suggested. I must say I find it difficult to concentrate on what Pamela says, so intrigued am I by the long spikes protruding from her eyelids. I know it's not particularly unusual for plump blondes in their late 20s to wear false eyelashes, but it's a very strange combination. Pamela's brisk white uniform, her matter-of-fact tone, and her body-going eyes. Repeatedly informs me that she comes every morning and evening for an hour, so I have what she calls time out. I don't take time out though, Patrick. I use this time to write. Anyway, it was Pamela who told me to get you out of bed as often as possible, suggesting that you could join the family table for meals. But I could see your hand was utterly wild as you brought the spoon to your face this morning, and I wanted to stop you to reach out and steady your wrist. But you looked at me just before it reached your lips, and your eyes were so alight with something unreadable. At that time I thought it was anger, but now I wonder if it wasn't a plea of some kind, that I was distracted. And so, wham! Over it went, milky slob dribbling into your lap and dripping on Tom's shoes. Pamela says that hearing is the last of the senses to go in a stroke patient. Even though you have no speech, you have excellent hearing, she says. It must be like being a toddler again, being able to comprehend others' words but unable to make your mouth form the shapes necessary to communicate fully. I wonder how long it'll be until you're able to stand. No one has said anything about this. The phrase, no one can say, has become detestable to me. How long can he stay on his feet, doctor? No one can say. How long until he's able to speak again? No one can say. Will he have another stroke? No one can say. Will he ever fully recover? No one can say. The doctors and nurses all talk of the next steps: physiotherapy, speech therapy, counseling, even for depression we've been warned can set in, but no one is prepared to forecast the likelihood of any of it actually working. My own feeling is that your greatest hope lies in recovery or just being here under this roof. Late September 1957. Early morning in the school gates, the sky is still more yellow than blue. Clouds are splitting above the bell tower. Wood pigeons were purring their terrible song of longing. Oh, 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 oh. And there Tom was, standing by the wall, returned to me. But then I'd been teaching for a few weeks and had grown more accustomed to facing the school day, so my legs were a little bit sturdier, my breath more controlled, but at the sight of Tom made my voice disappear completely. Marion, I'd imagined his sturdy face, his moon-white smile, the solidity of his naked forearm so many times. Now here he was, on Queen's Park Terrace, standing before me, looking smaller than I'd remembered, more refined. After almost 3 years' absence, his face had thinned, and he stood straighter. I wondered if I'd bump into you. Sylvie told me you started teaching here. Alice rumbled, pushed past us, singing, "Good morning, Miss Taylor," and I tried to pull myself together. "Don't run, Alice." I kept my gaze on her shoulders as I asked Tom, "What are you doing here?" He gave me a flicker of a smile. I was just taking a walk around King's Park, and I thought I'd look at the old school. Even at the time, I didn't quite believe the statement. Had he actually come here just to see me? Had he sought me out? The thought made me catch my breath. We were both silent for a moment, then I managed to say, "You're Bobby now, aren't you?" "That's right," he said. "Police Constable Burge is at your service." He laughed, but I could tell he was proud. Of course I'm still on probation, he added. He looked me up and down then, quite brazenly, taking his time over it. My hand tied around my basket of books while I waited to read the verdict on his face, but when his eyes met mine again, his expression remained the same, steady, slightly closed. It's been a long time. Things have changed, I said, hoping to draw a compliment, no matter how insincere. Have they? After a pause, he added, You certainly have. Then briskly, before I could blush too hard, I better let you get on. I'm remembering now that he looked at his watch, but that may not be true. I had a choice, Patrick. I could say a quick goodbye and spend the rest of my day wishing we'd spend more time together. Or I could take a risk. I could say something interesting to him. He'd returned and was standing before me in the flesh, and I could take my chance. I was older now, I told myself. I was 20 years of age, a redhead whose hair was set in brushed curls. I was wearing lipstick, light pink but lipstick nonetheless, and the blue frock with the trapeze skirt. It was a small September day, a gift of a day when the light was soft and the sun was glowing and as though it was summer. Ooh, 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 went the wood pigeons. So, I said, when are you going to give me that swimming lesson? He gave a big Tom laugh. It drowned out everything around us, the children's shouts in the schoolyard, the pigeons' calls. He slapped me on the back, twice. On the first slap, I almost fell forwards onto him. The air around me became very warm and I smelled vitalis. But the second, I steadied myself and laughed back. I'd forgotten that, he said. You still can't swim? I've been waiting for you to teach me. He gave a last, rather uncertain laugh. I bet you're a good teacher. Yes, and I need to be able to swim. I have to supervise the children in the pool. This was an out-and-out lie, and I was careful to look Tom full in the face as I uttered it. He slapped him on the back again, lightly this time. It was something he did often in the earlier days, and at the time I was thrilled by the warmth of his hand on my shoulder blades, but now I wonder if it wasn't Tom's way of keeping me at arm's length. You're serious? Yes. He put his hand in his hair, shorter now, less full, more controlled after the army, but still with that wave that threatened to break free at any moment, and looked down at the road as if searching for a response. Do you mind starting to see? It's not really advisable for beginners, but it's so warm at the moment. It would be a shame not to. The salted adds buoyancy. The sea it is. When? He looked me up and down, and this time I did not blush. 8 on Saturday morning, all right? I'll meet you between the piers, outside the milk bar. I nodded. He gave another laugh. Bring your costume, he said, starting off down the road. On Saturday morning, I rose early. I'd like to tell you that I dreamed all night of being in the waves with Tom, but that wouldn't be true. I don't remember what I dreamed, but it was probably located at the school, and it would have involved me forgetting what I was supposed to be teaching, or being locked in the stationery cupboard, unable to get out and witness the kind of havoc the children were creating. All of my dreams seemed to be along these lines at the time. No matter how much I longed to dream of Tom and myself in the sea, the two of us going out and coming in and going out with the waves. So I rose early, having dreamed of desks and chalk and cardboard milk bottle tops pierced with a straw, and from my window I saw that it was not a promising morning. It had been a mild September, but the month was drawing to a close now, and I walked past Victoria Gardens. The grass was soaked. I was very early, of course. Probably it wasn't even 7 yet, and this added to the delicious feeling I had of doing something secret. I had left my parents sleeping and had told no one where I was going. I was out of the house, away from the family, away from the school, and a whole day lay ahead. To pass the time, I still had 40 minutes to kill before the enchanted hour of 8 in the morning arrived. I strolled along the front. I walked from the palace to the West Pier, and on the morning the Grand Hotel in all its wedding cake whiteness, with the porter already standing to attention outside, complete with top hats and gloves, looked incredibly average to me. I didn't experience the pang I usually felt in passing the Grand, the pang of loneliness, the pang of longing for a husband's rooms with potted palms and ankle-deep carpets, for discreet bells rung by ladies in pearls. For that was how I imagined the place, fueled, I suppose, by films starring Sylvia Symes. No, the Grand could stand there, ablaze with money and pleasure. It meant nothing to me. I was happy to be going to the milk bar between the piers. Hadn't Tom looked me up and down, Hadn't he taken in the whole of me with his eyes? Wasn't he about to appear miraculously tall, taller than me, looking a bit like Kirk Douglas? Or was it Burt Lancaster? The set of his jaw, that steel in his eyes. I could never quite decide between the two he most resembled. I was very far at this point from what Sylvie had told me about Tom on the bench in Preston Park. I was a young woman wearing a tight pointed bra, carrying a yellow flowered bathing cap in her basket, ready her recently returned lover to seek her early morning swim. So I thought as I stood by the milk bar's creaking sign and looked out to the sea. I set myself a little challenge. Could I avoid looking towards the palace pier the way I knew he would come? Fixing my eyes on the water, I imagined him rising from the sea like Neptune, half draped in bladderwrack. His neck studded with barnacles, a crab hanging from his hair. He removed the creature and flung it aside as he shrugged off the waves. He'd make his way up noisily up the beach towards me, despite the pebbles, and would take me in his arms and carry me back to wherever it was he'd come from. I started to giggle to myself, and only the sight of Tom, the real living, breathing, land-walking Tom, stopped me. He was wearing a black t-shirt that had faded brown towel slung over his shoulders. On seeing me, he gave a brief wave and pointed to the way he'd come. "The club's got a changing room," he called, "this way, under the arches," and before I could reply, he walked off in the direction he was pointing. I remained standing by the milk bar, still imagining Neptune Tom coming out of the sea, dripping salt and fish, spraying the shore with brin and sea creatures from some deep, dark world beneath. Without turning around, he shouted, "Haven't got all day," and I followed him, hurrying behind, saying nothing until we reached the metal door of the arches. Then he turned and looked at me. "You did bring a hat, didn't you?" "Of course." He unlocked the door and pushed it open. Come down when you're ready, then. I'm going in." I went inside. The place was like a cave, damp and chalky smelling, the paint peeling from the ceiling and the rusty pipes running along one wall. The floor was still wet, the air clinging, and I shuddered. I hung my cardigan on a peg at the back of the room and unbuttoned my dress. I'd graduated from the red bathing costume I'd worn that day in the Lidos years ago, and had bought a bright green costume covered in swirly patterns from Peter Robinson's. I'd been quite pleased with the effect that when I tried it on in the shop. The cups of the bra were constructed from something that felt like rubber, and a short pleated skirt was attached to the waist. But here in the cavern of the changing room there was no mirror on the wall, just a list of swimming races with names and dates. I noticed that Tom had won the last one, so after pulling the flowered cap on my head and folding my dress on the bench, I went outside, wearing the towel around me. The sun was higher now, and the sea had taken on a dull glitter. Squinting, I saw Tom's head bobbing in the water. I watched as he emerged from the sea, standing in the shallows. He flicked his hair back and rubbed his hands up and down his thighs, as if he was trying to get some of the warmth back into his flesh. Almost toppling and having to grab my towel to keep it from falling to the ground, I managed to walk halfway down the beach in my sandals. The crunch and crack of the pebbles convinced me that the scene was real, that this was actually happening to me. I was approaching the sea, and I was approaching Tom, who was only wearing a pair of blue striped trunks. He came up to greet me, catching my elbow to steady me on the stones. "Nice cap," he said with a half smirk, and then, glancing down at my sandals, "Those will have to come off." I know that. I tried to keep my voice light and humorous like his. In those days, it was rare, wasn't it, Patrick, for Tom's voice to become what you might call serious. There was always a lot of up and down in it, a delicacy, almost a musicality. No doubt that's how you heard it, as though you couldn't quite believe anything he said. Over the years, his voice lost some of the musicality, partly, I think, in reaction to what had happened to you. But even now, occasionally, it's like there's a laugh behind his words, just waiting to sneak out. "Okay, we'll go in together. Don't think about it too much. Hold on to me. You'll get used to the water. It's not too cold today. Quite warm, in fact. It's the warmest this time of year, and it's very calm. So it's looking good. Nothing to worry about. It's also pretty shallow here, so we'll have to wait out a bit. Ready?" It was the most I'd heard him say, and I was a bit taken aback by his brisk professionalism. He used the same smooth tone I did when I was trying to coax my pupils to read the next sentence of a book without stumbling. I realized that Tom would make a good policeman. He had a knack of sounding as though he were in control. "Have you done this before?" I asked. "Taught people to swim?" "In the army, and at Sandgate. Some of the boys had never been in water. I helped them get their heads wet." He gave a short laugh. Despite Tom's assurance, on the contrary, the water was extremely cold. As I went in, my whole body clenched and the breath was sucked out of me. The stones drove into my feet and the water chilled my blood immediately, leaving my skin pimpled and my teeth chattering. I tried to concentrate my energy on the point where Tom's fingers met my elbow. I told myself that this contact was enough to make it all worthwhile. Tom, of course, made no sign of noticing the iciness of the water, the sharpness of the stones. As he walked in, the sea rocking at his thighs, I thought of how springy his body was. He was leading me, and so was slightly ahead. This allowed me to look at him properly, and as I did so, I managed to steady my juddering jaw and breathe through the cold that was smashing into my body with each step. So much Tom in the waves springing through the water, so much flesh, Patrick, and all of it shining on that bright September morning. He let the water splash up to his chest, still holding my elbow. Everything was moving, and Tom moved too. He moved with the sea or against it as he wished, whereas I felt the movement too late, or only just managed to maintain my balance. He looked back. "You all right?" Because he smiled at me, I nodded. "How does that feel?" he asked. How, Patrick, could I begin to answer him? "Fine," I said, a bit cold. "Good. You're doing well. Now we're going to do the tiniest bit of swimming. All I want you to do is follow me. And when we're deep enough, let your feet lift off the bottom, and I'll hold you up just so you can feel what it's like. Is that all right?" Was that all right? His face was so serious when he asked me this that it was hard to keep me from laughing. How could I object to the prospect of Tom holding me? We waited further out, and the water took my thighs and waist, touching every part of me with its freezing tongue. Then, when the sea was up to my armpits and beginning to splash at my mouth, leaving a salty trail on my lips, Tom put a hand to flat of my stomach and pressed. "Feet off the bottom," he commanded. I needn't tell you, Patrick, that I obeyed, utterly mesmerized by the huge strength of that one hand on my stomach, and by Tom's eyes, blue and changing like the sea on mine. I let my feet lift and was borne upward by the salt and the rocking motion of the water. Tom's hand was there, a steady platform. I tried to keep my head above the water, and for a second everything balanced perfectly on Tom's flat hand, and I heard him say, "Good, you're almost swimming." I turned to nod at him. I wanted to see his face, to smile at him, to have him smile back. Proud teacher, best pupil. And then the sea came up over my face and I couldn't see. In my panic, I lost his hand. Water rushed backward through my nose, and my arms and legs whipped about wildly, trying to find something to grip, some solid substance to anchor me. And I felt something soft and giving beneath my feet, Tom's groin. I knew it even then, and I pushed off from that and managed to come up for a breath of air. Heard Tom shouting something. Then, as I went under again, his arms were around me, gripping my waist and pulling me free of the water, so my breasts were nigh on his face, and I was still struggling, grasping for the air. And it wasn't until I heard him say, "You're all right, I've got you," in a slightly annoyed tone, that I stopped fighting and clung to his shoulders, my flowered bathing cap flapping loose at the side of my head like a piece of skin. He carried me back to shore in silence. When he deposited me on the beach, I couldn't look at him. "Take a moment," he said. "Sorry," I gasped. "Get your breath back, and then we'll try again." "Again?" I looked up at him. "You are joking." He ran a finger along the length of his nose. "No," he said, "I'm not joking. You have to get back in." I gazed down at the beach. The clouds were gathering now, and the day hadn't warmed up at all. He held out a hand to me. "Come on," he said, "just once." He smiled. "I may even forgive you for kicking me where you did." How could I refuse? Every Saturday after that, we met in the same place, and Tom tried to teach me to swim. I'd wait all week for the hour with Tom in the sea, and even as it got much colder, I felt this warmth in me, a heat in my chest that kept me from moving in the water, kept me swimming those few strokes towards his waiting arms. You won't be surprised to hear that I was deliberately a slow learner, and as the weather worsened, we were forced to continue our lessons in a pool, even though Tom still swam in the sea every day. And gradually we started talking. He told me that he joined the police force because it wasn't in the army, and everyone said he should. What with his height and his fitness, and it was better than working at Allen's West factory. But I could feel that he was proud of his job, and that he enjoyed the responsibility, even the danger of it. He seemed very interested in my job too. He asked a lot about how I taught the children, and I tried to give him answers that would sound intelligent without being off-putting. We talked about Lakita, the dog the Russians had sent into space, and how we both felt sorry for her. Tom said he'd like to go into space, and I remembered that and remember saying, "Perhaps you will one day," hysterically at my optimism. Occasionally we talked about books, but on this subject I was always more enthusiastic than Tom, so I was careful not to say too much. But you've no idea, Patrick, how liberating, how daring even to talk about these things with Tom. I'd always thought up to then that I should keep quiet about what I would now call my cultural interests. Too much talk about things was tantamount to showing off and getting ideas above your station. With Tom it was different. He wanted to hear about these things because he wanted to be a part of them too. We were both hungry for this other world, and back then it seemed as though Tom could be my partner in some new and yet unfinished adventure. Once we were both walking along the poolside, back to the changing rooms, both wrapped in our towels, Tom suddenly asked, "What about art?" I knew little about art. I'd taken art A level at school. Liked the Impressions, of course, particularly Degas and some of the Italian painters, and I like it. I've been going to the art gallery. This was the first that Tom had ever told me anything about what he did apart from swimming in his spare time. I could get really interested in it. He said, I've never looked at it before, you know what I mean? Why would I? I smiled. But now I am, and I think I'm seeing something there, something special. We reached the door of the changing rooms. Cold water was dripping down my back, and I began to shiver. Does that sound stupid? He asked. No, it sounds good. He grinned. I knew you'd think so. It's a great place. All sorts of paintings in there. I think you'd like it. Was our first date really going to be an art gallery? It wasn't the perfect location, but it was a start, I thought. So smiling brilliantly, I took off my swimming cap and shook my hair out in what I hoped was a seductive way. I'd love to go. Last week I saw this picture. Massive it was. Just of the sea. It looked like I could jump into it. Really, just jump into it and swim in the waves. Sounds wonderful. And there's this sculpture too, and watercolors, although I didn't like those as much. And drawings that looked unfinished, but I think they're supposed to be like that. There's all sorts. Now my teeth were chattering, but I kept smiling. Sure, an invitation would follow. Tom gave a laugh and slapped my shoulder. Sorry, Marion, you're cold. I should let you get dressed. He rubbed his fingers through his white hair. Same time next Saturday? It was like that every week, Patrick. We'd talk. We were good at talking back then. And then he'd disappear into the town, leaving me cold and damp, with only the trudge up to Albion Hill and the weekend with my family to look forward to. Some Saturday nights or Sunday afternoons, I met Sylvie at the pictures, but her time was mostly taken up by Roy, and so most of my weekends were spent sitting on my eider down, reading or preparing next week's lessons. I also spent a lot of time at the windowsill, looking out our tiny yard and remembering how it felt to be held by Tom in the water, occasionally spying a shiver in one of the neighbor's curtains, and wondering when it would all begin. A couple of months later, Sylvie and Roy announced their wedding date. Sylvie asked me to be her bridesmaid, and despite Fred teasing me about how I should really be the maid of honor, I looked forward to the event. It would mean a whole afternoon with Tom. No one used the phrase shotgun wedding, and Sylvie hadn't confided in me, but there was a general feeling that the speed of the preparations meant that Sylvie must be expecting. I presumed this was why Roy had coaxed up the aisle of All Saints. Certainly Mr. Burgess's face, rust red and drenched and clenched in a grin, suggested as much, and instead of fancy 3-tier cake and pomegranate affair that Sylvie and I had often discussed, the reception was held at the Burgesses' house with sausage rolls and mild ale for all. You would have laughed, Patrick, at the sight of me in my bridesmaid dress. Sylvie had borrowed it from a cousin who was smaller than me, and the thing barely skimmed my knees. It was so tight around me in the middle that I had to wear a Playtex girdle so that I could get the zip done up in the back. It was pale green, the color you might see on sugared almonds, and I don't know what it was made of, but it gave a soft sort of crunching noise as I followed Sylvie into the church. Sylvie looked fragile in her brocade frock and cropped veil. Her hair was white blonde, and despite the rumors, there was no sign of any thickening around the waist. She must have been freezing. It was early November, and the cold had bitten down hard. We both carried small posies of brownish chrysanthemums, and as I walked up the aisle, I saw Tom, who was sitting in the front pew, holding himself very staring at the ceiling. Seeing him in his gray flannel suit rather than swimming trunks made him look unfamiliar, and I smiled. knowing I'd seen the flesh beneath the stiff collar and tie. I stared at him, telling myself, it will be us. Next time, it will be us. And I could see it all, Tom waiting for me at the altar, looking back over his shoulder with a little smile as I entered the church, my red hair blazing in the light from the doorway. What took you so long, he teased, and I had replied, the best things are worth the wait. Tom looked at me. I snapped my gaze away and tried to concentrate instead on the back of Mr. Burgess's sweating neck. At the wedding, everyone was drunk, but Roy was more drunk than most. Roy was not a subtle drunk. He leant on the sideboard in Sylvie's living room, eating great chunks of wedding cake, staring at his new father-in-law. A few moments earlier, he'd shouted, "Lay off me, old man," and Mr. Burgess's unmoving back, and then retired to the sideboard to stuff his face. Now the room was quiet, and no one has moved as Mr. Burgess collected his hat and coat, stood at the door, and stated in a steady voice, "I'm not coming back in this house until you've hopped it and taken my trollop of a daughter with you." Sylvie fled upstairs, and all eyes turned to Roy, who was now crushing cake crumbs in his little fists. Tom put on a Tommy Steele record and shouted, "Who's for another?" while I made my way to Sylvie's room. Sylvie's sobs were loud and breathy, but when I pushed the door open, I was surprised to find she was not sprawled on the bed, beating the mattress with her fist, but standing in her mirror, naked except for her underwear, with both hands curled around her stomach. Her pink knickers were slightly slack at the back, but her bra stood up impressively. Sylvie had inherited her mother's expressive bosom. Catching my eye in the glass, she gave a loud sniff. "Are you all right?" I begged on her shoulder. She looked away, her chin quivering in the effort of suppressing another sob. Don't take any notice of your dad. He's over-emotional. He's losing a daughter today." Sylvie gave another sniff, and her shoulders drooped. I stroked her arm while she cried. After a while, she said, "It must be nice for you." "What must be?" "Being a teacher, knowing what to say." This surprised me. Sylvie and I never really discussed my job. Most of our conversations had been about Roy, or the films we'd seen, or records she bought. We'd been seeing less of each other since I started at the school, and perhaps this wasn't just because I had less time and she was busy with Roy. It was more like at home. It was like at home. I never felt quite comfortable talking about the school, about my career, as I was afraid to call it, because no one knew the first thing about teaching. To my parents and brothers, teachers were the enemy. None of them enjoyed school, and although they were quietly pleased, if a little puzzled by my surprise at the grammar, my decision met with silence. The last thing I wanted was to be what my parents despised, a toffee-nosed show-off, and so, as often as not, I said nothing about how I spent my days. "I don't know what to say all the time, Sylvie." Sylvie shrugged. "It won't be long before you can get a place of your own now, though, will it? You'll be earning proper money." It was true. I started saving money, and it had crossed my mind that I could rent a room somewhere, perhaps on one of the wide streets in northern Brighton, near the Downs, or even on the seafront at Hove. But I didn't relish the thought of living alone. Women didn't live alone then, not if it could be helped. You and Roy will have a place of your own, too. My own. I'd like to be on my own, sniffed Sylvie, so I could do what I bloody well like. I doubted this, and said in a soft voice, "But you're with Roy now. You'll be a family. That's much better than being alone." Sylvie turned away from me and sat on the edge of the bed. "Got a hanky?" she asked, and I passed her mine. She blew her nose loudly. Sitting next to her, I watched as she took off her wedding ring and then slid it back on again. It was a thick, dark gold band, and Roy had one to match, which surprised me. I hadn't thought he was a man who would wear jewelry. "Marion," she said, "I've got to tell you something." Leaning close to me, she whispered, "I lied." "Lied?" "I'm not expecting a baby. I lied to him, to everyone." I stared at her, uncomprehending. We have done it and everything, but I'm not pregnant." She put a hand over her mouth and let out a sudden shrill laugh. "It's funny, isn't it?" I thought of Roy's open mouth, full of cake, of his eagerness to push Sylvie along the roller rink, of the way he couldn't tell what was interesting to talk about and what was not. What an absolute fool he was. I looked at Sylvie's stomach. "You mean there's nothing in there?" "Well, just my insides." Then I began to giggle too. Sylvie bit down Sylvie put down on her hand to stop herself from laughing too loudly, but soon we were both rolling on the bed, clutching one another, shuddering with barely suppressed mirth. Sylvie wiped her face with my hanky, and took a deep breath. I didn't mean to lie, but I couldn't think of any other way. It's a terrible thing, isn't it? Not so terrible. She tucked her blonde hair behind her ears and giggled again, rather listlessly this time. Then she fixed me with her eyes. Marian, how am I going to explain it to him? The intensity of Sylvie's stare, the hysteria of our laugh just moments before, and the stout I'd drunk must have made me reckless. Patrick, for I replied, say you lost it. He's not going to know, is he? Wait a bit, and then say it's gone. It happens all the time. Sylvie nodded. Maybe. It's an idea. He'll never know, I said, clasping her hands in mine. No one will know. Just us, she said. Tom offered me a cigarette. Is Sylvie all right? He asked. It was late afternoon now, getting dark. In the gloom of the back of the Burgesses' garden, beneath the wedge of ivy, I leant on the coal bunker, and Tom sat on the upturned bucket. She's fine, I inhaled, and waited for the dizzy feeling to knock me slightly out of time. I'd started smoking only recently. To enter the staff room, you had to push your way through a curtain of smoke anyway, and I'd always liked the smell of my father's senior service. Tom smoked players' weights, which weren't as strong, but when the first hit came, my mind sharpened, and I focused my eyes on him. He smiled at me. You're a good friend to her. I haven't seen her much lately, not since the engagement. I blushed as I said the word, and I was glad of the darkening sky and the shade of the ivy. When Tom didn't respond, I galloped on. Not since we've been seeing one another. Seeing one another was not what we were doing, not at all, but Tom didn't contradict me. Instead, he nodded and exhaled. There was a noise of slamming doors from the house, and someone stuck their head out of the back and shouted, Bride and groom are leaving. We'd better see them off, I said. As I straightened up, Tom put a hand on my hip. He touched me here before, of course, but this time there was no solid reason for him to do it. This wasn't a swimming lesson. He didn't need to touch me, so he must have wanted to, I reasoned. It was this touch, more than anything, that convinced me to act as I did over the following few months, Patrick. It went right through the sugar almond green of my frock and into my hip. People say that love is like a lightning bolt, but this wasn't like that at all. This was like warm water spreading through me. I'd like you to meet somebody, he said. I'd be interested to know what you think. This was not the utterance for which I'd hoped. I'd hoped for no utterance at all. I'd hoped, in fact, for a kiss. Tom let his hand fall from my hip, and he stood up. Who is it? I asked. A friend, he said. I thought you might have things in common. My stomach turned to cold lead. Another girl. Should we see them off? He works at the art gallery. To cover the relief I felt on hearing the masculine pronoun, I took a long drag on my cigarette. You don't have to, said Tom. It's up to you. I'd love to, I said, exhaling a plume of smoke, my eyes watering. We looked at each other in the face. Are you all right? He asked. I'm fine. Perfectly fine. Let's go in. As I turned to walk back into the house, he put his hand on my hip again, bent towards me, and let his lips brush my cheek. Good, he said. Sweet Marian. And he strode indoors, leaving me standing in the gloom, my fingers touching the dampness he'd left on my skin.